Now the title speaks of an emerging diaconate. So we have to kind of realize, where are we at this historical point in time? When the diaconate was restored in 1967 by Pope Paul VI, it took one form. But we've moved decades since then. So the diaconate today is significantly different, or significantly developed, perhaps a better word, than it was certainly in 1967, when nobody had a clue about what to do with deacons. Can you imagine being a priest in a diocese? The bishop comes home in 1965 from the council, tries to educate everybody in the diocese about what happened at the council. 2 years later, the Pope comes out and says, oh yeah, that bit about ordaining guys as deacons, go ahead and do that. And the bishop, who was at the council, turns to his favorite priest and says, oh, by the way, Tom, you're in charge of setting up a diaconate formation process. Make me deacons. Tom says, why? The only experience he would have had, especially here in the States, of being a deacon was what he went through in the seminary for, what, 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year? And I'm supposed to now have an idea of how to form. There was nothing from Rome on how to form deacons. There was nothing from the Bishops' Conference yet on how to form deacons. Those early pioneers were really making this up out of whole cloth as they went. That affects the vision. Who are these men going to be? And certainly the renewed diaconate post-council is different from the diaconate in 67 AD. Like I say, the diaconate's been around for the whole time. But how the diaconate has been used by the church has varied. Plus, the renewal of the diaconate didn't occur in a vacuum. We've got other things going on. And I've written about this quite a bit. At the same time the council renews the diaconate as a permanent order, it also encourages and almost, does, oblige laity to be engaged in the world and in the church, and active, co-responsible partners. Okay? That's happening. And then what happens? The priest shortage hits worldwide. So you've got this confluence of 3 separate streams coming together. You've got a priest shortage, you've got lay ministers, and you've got these new deacons. All coming together saying, we're going to help. The problem has been, over the last few decades, is that as those streams have met, it's caused some tension. What's the proper role of laity? What's the proper role of deacons? And what do we do with the dwindling number of priests, which then puts more demands on both laity and deacons to fill that void? And that causes all kinds of room for mischief. So here's what I hope we can do in the time today, and I want to try to leave a lot of time for discussion and Q&A at the end. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what was the vision of the founders, what was on the mind of the bishops at the council, and then talk a little bit about where we are today with diaconate, and then overlay that with that vision. What are the clues we get from the council compared to the reality we experience today, especially here in the United States? And where does that lead us? Where do we go from there? So the vision of the founders. And I know some of you have seen this slide before. I just love to use it. If any of you have ever been to St. Peter's, you probably all wish you brought binoculars with you. One of my favorite stories, one of the titles that Mike mentioned was Commander in the Navy. And when I was a junior officer, I was embarked on a submarine called the USS Billfish. It wasn't deliberately, my name, but it was. I was an intelligence collection specialist, and I led a team of 18 guys on board the submarine, and we would go on special operations. When the ship was underwater and we couldn't use our antennas, you had free time. So I would read. I was sitting in the wardroom one day and I was reading a book on the Second Vatican Council, and in walked our executive officer, the number 2 in the chain of command, And he was a very obnoxious, loud atheist. And he would mock religion at the drop of a hat, just spin the rest of us up. So he walks in, he says, "Spook, what are you reading?" And I could have said I was reading a book on naval engineering or anything, but I said, "I'm reading a book about the Second Vatican Council, XO." Second Vatican Council? He says, "What the heck was that?" He says, "Oh yeah, I remember. Second Vatican Council, that's when the Catholic Church sold out to the Beatles." But as funny as that is, you ask most of our parishioners if they can even recall anything about the Second Vatican Council or what they've heard of it. They associate it as an event of the 60s. And so this isn't so far-fetched. And they forget that Pope John called the council in January of '59. I don't even think the Beatles had gone to Germany yet. So this is not about the 60s. And we have to dissuade ourselves of that. I came across an interesting fact not too long ago. The average age of the bishops at Vatican II in 1962 at the opening of the council was 62. That's good for me as a theologian because I can do that math. I can actually handle that math. So I think what's important is, and I ask my students to do this a lot. Think for a moment. You went home from this conference and you find a letter addressed to you from Pope Benedict, inviting you to come next year to Rome for an international gathering on the future of the church. And he wants you to be an active participant in that event, in that council. Vatican III. And you're going. He's opening it up. Now you ask yourself, if I know I've got this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, what do I want to talk about? Sometimes just ponder that. If I had that one chance, what would I want to bring to his attention? What would I want to bring to the council's table? That's what 2,640 bishops did in 1962 to 1965. They brought with them their lived experience from around the world. First time ever bishops gathered that were truly bishops from around the world. The first African cardinal was named by John the 23rd in 1961. Before that, bishops in that part of the world had names like Smith and O'Rourke because they were American or European bishops who were then sent to those countries to serve as bishops. When I was in command of a base on Okinawa, my last assignment in the Navy, we had for the first time ever a newly appointed bishop of Naha, Okinawa. And he was an Okinawan. First time ever. Up to then, it had all been American-born OFM Capuchins. So that was think about that. So now what have these bishops brought in with them? If you're 62 years old in 1962, what's your life look like? Let's imagine you're a German bishop. So while you're a teenager, what's going on? The First World War. So horrific. We sometimes forget this because of what happened later. This was called the war to end all wars. And this is in my teenage years? Think back to your teenage years. Think of how things that happened to you as a teenager still affect you today, one way or the other. 1918, Russian Revolution, the establishment of communism, first great totalitarian, atheistic powerhouse. By the time you're in your 20s, you're having worldwide economic collapse. The Great Depression didn't just happen here. It was worldwide. My father-in-law is from Germany. He always, till the day he died, he talked about the days of the Great Depression in Germany and needing a wagon to pull the Deutschmarks to buy a loaf of bread. Now imagine, Great Depression, 1929, you're maybe by now a young newly ordained priest working in a parish. trying to help your parishioners survive it. You're going to probably think about that as you walk into the council chamber. Rise of fascism. Nazism. Hitler comes to full power in 1933. We Americans tend to think World War II started in 1941. Mm-mm. Then you got the Spanish Civil War. Europe is a mess. I get stunned sometimes when I talk about Vatican II to folks, to Americans, and they say, Vatican II was the biggest darn mistake in the world. Church was in good shape. Seminaries were full, convents were full, parishes were being built, dioceses were being set up. And then Vatican II comes along and screws it up. There was no need to have a council. That was the golden age of the church in the 1950s. Really? Hitler opens up Dachau in 1933, the first of the concentration camps. Dachau would become the preferred prison camp for priests. Before you turn 46, the world enters a new age and enters into the badly misnamed Cold War. Within a week of the Second Vatican Council's opening, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think the boys walking into the council on October 11th were thinking about the Beatles. Just don't think so. This was on their mind. This is what they brought into the council chamber with them. They're having too much fun. Let me just focus a little bit, and we're talking about Adolf Hitler. But I just wanted to show you something. I mean, this graphic kind of says it all. This is 1943, 1944. Every black dot is a concentration camp. My first set of orders in the Navy after boot camp were to go to Hebrew language school. I'd spent 8 years in the seminary, and they sent me to Hebrew language school. It was great. But our head teacher had been incarcerated in a concentration camp in France. And when he told us that, I'd never realized there had been concentration camps in France. Dachau was the first, and it was the school for the SS. This is where they tried things out first. Nearly 3,000 priests incarcerated in Dachau. Less than half will survive it. The lead priest was a Jesuit by the name of Otto Pies. He served as kind of the superior general of the priests assembled there. And they would meet in secret. They even held a secret ordination to the priesthood of a very ill transitional deacon. They actually arranged that because a bishop had been arrested from Belgium and thrown in Dachau. Oh, we have a bishop here now. Let's ordain this guy before he dies. So they do. Now, what's all this got to do with what we're talking about here? The importance of religion. One of the first general orders the commandant gets at Dachau concerns priests, ministers, rabbis of all faiths, religious persons of all faiths. And they are to receive no special treatment. They are to be housed with the general prison population. The claim was made that clergy have been living a life of privilege far too long, and so you just put them in with everybody. Now, I know this sounds like the beginning of a horrific joke, but if you put a priest, a minister, and a rabbi in the same cell block, what do you have? You've got church. You've got shul. People they're not going to feel as abandoned, as disconnected as before. Some of the guards would actually smuggle in little bits of wine. And the priest would sometimes hoard a piece of bread and use that and say Mass in secret. I mean, there was a faith life in each of these cells, which was actually quite stunning. But then the Nazis caught on. And about 1939, 1940, they cleared out a cell block, nicknamed it the Priesterblock, and threw all the priests in it. so they could keep an eye on the priests, and so the priests supposedly wouldn't be able to minister. Well, one cell block wasn't enough, so they wound up with 2 or 3 more. But now what do the priests do? Now they're able not only to smuggle themselves out to minister in secret, now they can also have conversation. And so as rumors, as they hear about D-Day in 1944 and rumors of liberation are around the corner, these guys begin to talk and they take notes. And later they will write books and journal articles about all of this. That's how we know about it. And the primary question that they asked was, where the heck was the church in the first half of the 20th century that we weren't more effective witnesses to Christ and help prevent some of this madness? And what do we have to do in the future to prevent this from happening again? That was it. And so the program of reform that we see emerge at the Second Vatican Council, a lot of stuff, a lot of ink's been spilled on how so much of this came from the Europeans, the Germans, those liberal hippie Germans. Why? Because they and the French were among the first to recognize something's got to give. Especially after the bomb. Because we're all just crazy enough to want to use it again. So, these guys begin to write. And on this program of reform, among the things they talk about is diaconate. Because in Germany, they've been talking about restoring a permanent diaconate for over 100 years. They just hadn't ever quite got around to it. They had some of the same questions that we still experience today. We're not quite sure how they'd fit in, how we'd use them. Not quite sure about that. These guys now were sure. Because of what? Of what they had learned in the camp. What they learned in the camp, and they wrote about it, was it didn't matter for me as a priest if I didn't have my collar to wear. And all I was in prison rags. I'm still a priest. It didn't matter that I didn't have a historic cathedral to say Mass in. I'll say it right here on the floor if I have to. But that the heart of ministry lied in putting yourself at risk to serve others. That's what they rediscovered. That's what they rediscovered. And they said, maybe that's the sign of the kenotic Christ, of Christ who pours himself out for others, puts himself at risk for others. Maybe that's the sign that we've been missing. And maybe a renewed diaconate, working in partnership with the sign of Christ the priest, will present a more complete image of Christ to the world. And they begin having conversations about what it would mean to be a servant church, a diaconal church. In 1950 and 51, a young German forestry worker who was a Caritas volunteer came across all of these memoirs. He felt stirring within himself, had conversations with his wife. He said, I really feel called to be a deacon. Went to see his bishop in Freiburg. Ordained me deacon. This is what I want to do. And I'm ready to set things up here, to study and to coordinate. Bishop said, I can't do it. Canon law says I can't do that. Canon law of 1917 said no bishop could ordain a man to any order of ministry if he did not have a reasonable expectation of ordaining that man eventually to the priesthood. It was against the law. So one of the first things Paul VI is going to have to do when he changes that is actually change the law to permit people, bishops, to do that. But his bishop said, I can't do it under the current law. But go off and study about it. So he begins to start these deacon circles. And they're men and women from around the area who come together a couple of nights a week. They study. They bring in professors to talk about theology and scripture and what they can remember about diaconate from the patristic age, all of that kind of stuff. And then they let the professor go home, and they would sit around and say, okay, now next week we need to set up a new feeding station on the corner of Fürstendamm and whatever. They were practical diaconal ministers. It wasn't just studying. It wasn't just intellectual. It was think of Europe in 1950. Still destroyed from the war. And these folks came together to do it. By the time of the council, there's going to be close to 40 of these deacon circles around Western Europe. And they form an international diaconate circle in Freiburg around Hannes. He kind of becomes the grand poobah of that little informal network. And they open up a storefront in Rome during the council so that if bishops want to talk about diaconate, they can stop by. And they've been collecting all of the research from 1950 on to show the bishops. Good friend of mine, theologian named Ed Hannenberg. Really great young guy and a wonderful theologian. He wrote a book one time, and I still give him heck about it. Because he said, the diaconate being renewed, that was really something imposed by the bishops. There was no groundswell from below. I said, my God, Ed, you got to come to my talk. So, then this theologian by the name of Karl, not Hugo, decided he wanted to write about this. He became entranced by this. And he was one of the early big heavyweight theologians to start getting into the game on this. Of course, once Karl started to write on it, everybody wanted to write on it. It came up at the International Catechetical Week in 1956. This is the first time we hear a bishop from the Third World talk about maybe deacons could help us too. By the way, his name was Bishop Willem van Beckum, born and raised in the Netherlands, but he was serving in Indonesia. That was all about the change. And finally, Pius XII, especially the 1957, he was at a Eucharistic Congress in Rome on the laity, and he was asked a question, what do you think about all this talk coming out of Germany and Italy and France about the possibility of a permanent diaconate again? And he said, well, the time isn't quite right for it, but when it is, deacons will again take their rightful place among the clergy of the church. So he certainly didn't close the door. Then he said something that all of us love to hear as theologians. I want my theologians and bishops to continue to research and debate the issue. Thank you. There you go. I'm only doing what the Pope said to do. Now, we all know about John Paul II's biography and know what he went through during World War II. Shortly before he died, he wrote this in his message on World Day of Peace, describing World War II as an abyss of violence, destruction, and death unlike anything previously known. Now think about this. If I've been through any part of these events, how's that going to affect what I go and do at the council? Any one of them. So I maintain that Vatican II itself has always been the Church's response to World War II, to the causes that led up to it, and the world that emerged out of it. This was the Council's attempt at trying to deal with that. Okay, I kind of mentioned some of this before, just to kind of back up and look specifically at diaconate. The earliest known record we have in the modern era about a renewed diaconate comes from about 1840 in an exchange of letters between a German doctor and a priest friend of his, who later became a cardinal. And he basically said, I think right now there's too great a distance between many of our priests here in Germany and the people they serve. There's just this big gap, and people feel detached from the institutional church. Sound familiar? The whole idea of new evangelization, getting people to feel connected again with the church. He came up with two solutions that he suggested to his friend. One is, and I love the way he phrased it, in the 1800s, he said, one is we can allow our priests to marry as the Greeks do, meaning the Greek Orthodox, or the Greek Catholics for that matter, as the Greeks do. He said, but that would probably take a council. And we don't have time for a council. He said the second thing we could do right away, and that's to reinvigorate the ministry of the deacon. Because the deacon would be living here right among the people he's serving, and yet he'd have a mission from the bishop to proclaim the gospel. And that would go a long way to reconnecting people to the institution of the church. Caritas. If you're familiar with Caritas, you don't need my explanation. If you're not, it would be roughly analogous to like Catholic Charities. It's a primarily lay-driven association. By 1897, it was required in every German diocese to have a Caritas organization. Obviously, you put that kind of thing together, you've got to have a journal. And in the Caritas journal, we begin to find references to, wouldn't it be nice if some among us were called to be deacons? Not that they all needed to be deacons to do stuff, but that if we're all called to serve others, some among us should sacramentalize that. Should kind of be icons for us for that. We can look to them for inspiration and empowering. Of course, then we hit the 20th century, and things go south and get put on hold for a while. But look at this. In 1934, now remember, Hitler comes to power in 33, that's when Dachau opens in 1933. So in 1934, the head of Caritas is writing that Caritas is an essential element of the church, and there's need for some official recognition of those who act in the church's name. He comes just this close from saying deacons, but he's getting there. After he's arrested, his successor comes out a few years later and says, we want to have deacons. Because what was Hitler doing? Hitler was taking all of these sort of autonomous agencies and making them part of the government. So the Deutsche Bank became the Reichsbank. And what the folks in Caritas were worried about, what if this becomes the Reichscaritas? But you can't take away ordination. They could shut it down, they could restructure it, they could do all kinds of things, but if I'm an ordained deacon or priest or bishop, they can't take that part of it away from us. And we will still be able to retain that focus. The other interesting insight here is that deacons would be what I call ministers of connect the dots. They would link worship, witness, and service. Word, worship, service would all be seen in one person in a special way to link them. So as the council begins, there is a sense among the bishops that diaconia, sacramentally linked to word and worship, is an essential element in the life of the church. It's not some nice add-on. You know, I could no longer go to Sunday Mass and walk out of Sunday Mass and say, that's it, I'm done for the week, I'm a good Catholic. You just couldn't do that. It all goes together. And because it's a constitutive part of who we are supposed to be as a people of God, the bishops had this sense that it should be reflected in the sacramental economy of the church. If this is so important to us, there should be a way to celebrate that, to sacramentalize it. And always, 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 when one considers the diaconate, it has to be seen within the much broader context of overall church renewal, not in antithesis of it. Some of our American bishops, when the diaconate emerged in the, say, early 70s, some bishops felt they had to make a choice and say, no, I want to promote lay ministry. So I'm not going to do deacons, because that will just keep us more clerical. So they felt they had to make a choice. Now most of the bishops have come to a more balanced understanding and say, no, I want to support lay ministry, but we also need this witness as well. We need both and, not either or. And that's much more in line with what we see from the Council Fathers. Karl Rahner got so wrapped up in diaconate, he published a 536-page book that's never been completely published in English. We've been working on it for years, still not available totally in English, on the diaconate. It's a remarkable book. If you read German, enjoy. At the council, there were close to 9,000 proposed agenda items that came in from the bishops around the world. 9,000. I would not have wanted to be on that staff. But 101 of those concerned the diaconate alone, representing a couple of hundred bishops from around the world. 90 of those proposals were in favor of a permanent diaconate. Only 11, representing only 21 bishops, were against the idea. That's pretty significant before the council even starts. Here's another picture I throw up just because I like it. Who's on the left? Ronner. Guy on the right? Used to be when I showed this picture, a lot of people would know who Ronner was and had no clue who the guy on the right was. It's amazing how history has changed over the years. The other thing that fires up some folks is, why is the Pope in a tie? He's a good German theologian, priest theologian. That's the uniform. So who had the vision? About 66% of, because I counted all of them, of these proposals came from Western Europe. You add to the bishops from Eastern Europe and it goes, of course, even higher. But this is largely a European phenomenon. And then, during the council, bishops from other parts of the world said, hey, you know, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do that. This is, again, kind of interesting for those of you who have not had the chance to look at this. Of course, we always say it's not about what we do, but who we are. But it's important to know that function is important. And how did the vision of these bishops see these new deacons being used? First of all, they talked about ordaining guys of a mature age, especially if they were going to be married. And that mature age was to be 40. We're going to see how that changes in a minute. But then the functions that are there. Okay, so I bet you we're going to have some social justice things here, right? Oh, no. Most frequently mentioned is that the person should be an experienced catechist. Here being used in the worldwide meaning of catechist. Not simply someone who teaches religious ed, although that's a part of it, but actually we would say probably today more of a pastoral administrator. Someone who's been involved in the leadership of a parish. So they wanted these guys to be already doing this. Parish administration. The last survey we took of deacons said that we hate parish administration as much as priests do. But this is, the bishops were thinking they could pawn some of this off. Administration of church goods and property. Again, a traditional role of the deacon in the ancient church. Deacon was the protector of the temporalities. Official preaching and teaching. Here in this country, this came late. But in Europe, you're ordained, you preach. And you better preach well. Gets to spin. Presiding at extreme unction, anointing of the sick, and other sacraments. We don't do that, but it was brought up. So interesting, notice what's not on there. The whole social justice thing. The important thing, I think the important takeaway from this is to realize that the way the bishop saw this new deacon was that this was already a person who was fully engaged in service in the church and in the world, already there. The reaction would be, Peter's going to become a deacon. And the response of the assembly would be, absolutely, that makes perfect sense. What you don't want is Peter's going to be a deacon. Who? Him? Okay? This got us in trouble in the early days of the diaconate. Because we were ordaining sometimes a lot of guys for whom this was a new idea. And they made those kind of neophyte mistakes as a result. Okay, first draft of Lumen Gentium goes through 4 drafts. First draft, we're not even there at all. For those of us who are deacons already, we know how that feels. We're never there. But in the final draft, where we have the famous paragraph 29, the last paragraph of chapter 3, it's important to understand how that chapter is structured, and just that alone will tell you the tale. Paragraph 18 to 27, those 11 paragraphs are about bishops. That's the primary purpose of that chapter. Then there's one paragraph dealing with the priesthood, and another paragraph dealing with deacons. This is what has led Cardinal Walter Casper to describe priests and deacons as the 2 arms of the bishop. We both extend the reach of the bishop in different ways. When we get into the debates, Cardinal Suenens of Belgium, my second hero, my first hero is John the 23rd, but Suenens is my second. He gets up and talks to the bishops. And he says, okay, here's what we're after here. First of all, we're not going to pass a law that says you all have to have deacons. Maybe he should have, but it never would have passed probably then. But he did something that I've seen our bishops do here in the United States. And it's very helpful to understand Episcopal psychology. Many times our bishops will vote on something not because they are in favor of it themselves, that they intend to make use of this, but because you bishops need it and have expressed a need for it. So I want to vote to support you. So a lot of bishops would say, well, I don't intend at this point to do anything with diaconate, but all you guys wanted it, so I'm not going to vote against it. I'll vote for it so you can. That's what Suenens is talking about. Secondly, as they got into the debate, 40 was seen as far too old. Too old. And they lowered the age to 35. Now, it's an interesting dynamic, because a lot of times when people get into this for the first time, they think that, well, transitional deacons were 22, 23 years old, and they raised this more mature age thing at 35. No. The proposal was 40. The bishop said, I can't use them at 40. Give them to me younger. And finally, thanks to Suenens, there's a growing appreciation of the theological understanding of diaconate. This isn't going to be just about function. This is going to be about what the deacon is supposed to sacramentalize in himself. First of all, remember, this is the same council that's going to go to Paul VI and say we don't need subdeacons anymore. And we don't need ordained porters, lectors, exorcists, and acolytes anymore. They're going to do away with that whole system. They could easily have said we want to do away with deacons too. That the contemporary church only needs priests and bishops. So they actually have a vote to say, do we want the office of deacon in the church? Any kind of deacon. And the answer is yes. What about as permanent deacons? Yes. Does the Pope have to approve it if you want to do it? Look at the number who said no. But the votes for yes carried. So now a bishop's conference has to go to Rome to say we would like to do this. Do we have your permission? And then the Pope says yes. Could we ordain mature married men at 35 to the diaconate? Yes. And just to be sure, because they knew this would raise the agita of some and concern for some, they thought they'd ask the same question a different way. Would it be okay to ordain younger non-celibate men? No. But look at the number that said yes. The bishops wanted deacons. Marital status was not really their prime concern. Very little consensus of what they were restoring. I mean, again, none of these 2,640 bishops had ever known a permanent deacon. None of them had ever served as a permanent deacon. I mean, think about that. What an act of faith this was. Did they think there were going to be problems? You bet. Well, we'll deal with those as they come up. There was no attempt. At the Council of Trent, there was talk about bringing back the ancient diaconate. At this council, they don't talk like that. They don't say, we want to bring the diaconate as Ignatius of Antioch would have known it, and bring it into the 20th century. There's no talk about that. There's talk about the antiquity of the order being transformed into the modern world. One great unknown. We had developed in the West a great tradition of the relationship of celibacy to holy orders. But what about matrimony to holy orders? When we were preparing the National Directory on the diaconate at the Bishops' Conference, one of the questions that came up was, how do we talk about this? Well, maybe we can get some insight from some of our Eastern Catholic bishops who have married priests and deacons, have had all along. So I called one of the Eastern bishops, but some of you may know his work, Sili Bajani. He's a Maronite core bishop. He's written 22 books on Eastern Syriac theology. And I called him, he's a good friend, and I said, Sili, I need a quote. I need something from Chrysostom or somebody that talks about matrimony and orders and all this. And he started to laugh. I said, why are you laughing? And he said, because, Bill, this is the Eastern Catholic Church. We just live it. We don't write about it. Good friend of mine, Joe Kamanchak, likes to say that the Second Vatican Council did not restore deacons because of a shortage of priests, but because of a shortage of deacons. And that is absolute truth. And if you study the debates at the council, not once was it brought up, oh, we got to have these guys because we're running out of priests. That was never the issue. John Paul II in 1993, of course, he was a council father. He wrote this, and it's a nice reflection back into the vision, the idea that the bishops had about diaconate. That a particular need behind the decision was that of a greater and more direct presence of sacred ministers in areas such as family, work, schools, etc., as well as in the various ecclesial structures. And this is one of my major points today. We have become, especially here in the States, a parish-based ministry, and that has got to stop. I don't mean leaving the parish altogether, or not using the parish as a home base. But deacons cannot simply look through a parish lens at everything. So we'll talk about that. So, to kind of wrap this part of it up, the founder's vision saw diaconate as primarily younger men, and a few of the bishops did bring up the subject of ordaining women. That was quickly tabled. Figured we got to get deacons back first. We got to convince everybody about this first. And the idea would be that the deacons, these younger guys, would still, in fact, be engaged in the world, raising families, working. Why? Because then their influence can be felt in those areas. The idea of a deacon who would leave all that behind and say, now I'm done raising my family and I've retired from my job, now I will go be deacon. That was alien to what they were trying to do. That was alien. I didn't get ordained to go hang out at the rectory. The whole point was that deacons would be connected to the bishop and then be an extension of the bishop into the world, into new areas. So when I hear a pastor, for example, tell me, oh, we don't need a deacon in our parish, Bill, because all of our needs are being met. What's he saying? He's saying the parish's needs are being met. First, I find that a little hard to believe, but okay. We pay Father to be parochial. We pay him to have that focus. But I need somebody there that's going to say, but what about the needs we're not meeting as a parish? Is there no one still hungry or homeless or in need of hospice care or AIDS support, whatever it is? All of those needs in the community are being met. That's where the deacon engages. That's where the deacon needs. And here's the core text that has led me to this whole thing. We all talk about John the 23rd's famous opening speech at the council. And well, we should. But we should also look at Paul VI's closing address at the council. This is on December 7th, the day before the solemn closing outside in the square. This is inside St. Peter's. The only attendees are the 2,700 bishops that have gathered. This is a little intimate gathering inside St. Peter's. And in the midst of his homily, this is what the Pope says. We stress that the teaching of the council is channeled in one direction, the service of humankind, of every condition, every weakness and need. The Church has declared herself to be servant of humanity, at the very time when her teaching role and pastoral government have assumed greater splendor and vigor. However, the idea of service has been central. There it is. We are servant church, and he is merely reporting what the bishops themselves say in Gaudium et Spes and in Lumen Gentium. Keep this in mind. Pope Paul VI, talking about the church as servant when he restores the diaconate. He refers to the diaconate as a driving force for the church's service. Deacons are not ordained to go take care of the marginalized so that the rest of the church doesn't have to. What I challenge our deacons to do is say, if somebody asks you to go visit the sick, you say, absolutely, I'm going to go visit the sick. I'm a Christian. I should do that. But as deacon, I'm going to get 12 more people to come with me and train them up. And then after a while, after they're trained up and they're doing that, then I'm going to, nobody's going to the prison. I'm going to go to the prison because I'm a Christian and I should visit those who are in prison. But I'm going to take a few people with me and get them trained up too. And get them visiting. And then I'm going to move on to something. See? That's the whole notion of servant leadership. But we aren't ordained so that you don't have to. So current issues and questions. We're doing it. All right. I put this all on one slide. And at this point, let's get a conversation. But let me just kind of whip through these real quick, and then we can talk about it. One of the things we are still challenged by is an ongoing lack of a developed theology of diaconate. Why is that an issue? Well, for over a millennium, the only way we talked about ordained ministry was in priestly terms. So anytime we talked about ordination, it was about priest. And what we are achieving over this last 40 years or so is an understanding that not every time we talk about ordination are we talking about something priestly. We can be talking about something else. So this need continues for a developed theology on diaconate. Certainly related to a theology of the priesthood, but something that recognizes the distinctiveness. The relationship to the bishop. I think this is actually, in most dioceses, pretty good. It could be a lot better. Again, the significant thing here sacramentally and liturgically is when you go to the ordination of a priest, who lays hands on that newly ordained priest? All the priests who are there. If you go to the ordination of a bishop, who lays hands on the new bishop? All the bishops who are there. You go to the ordination of a deacon, who lays hands on that deacon? Only the ordaining bishop. I was ordained in Washington, D.C., all by myself. Got all the undivided attention. There were 3 bishops there, the cardinal and 2 others. Who laid hands on my head? The cardinal, and only, not even the auxiliary bishops. That relationship with the bishop is paramount for us. We are the bishop's assistants. What is the scope of diaconal ministry? As I said, here in the States, Father Nick Rice nailed this 10, 15 years ago now. The parochialization of the diaconate. We have allowed ourselves to become so focused on the parish that we have a hard time, many of us, seeing outside the parish. That's led many dioceses to lead to a dual assignment. We try to do it in Monterey, where every deacon gets an assignment both to a parish and to something extra parochial. Okay, I said that. We have to do something about the age in the United States. The average age of a deacon in the United States is 64. The average age of a deacon everywhere else in the world is in the 40s. When I go overseas and represent the diaconate in the United States, I get so much grief. You guys in America have turned it into a retirees club, huh? And then I'll come back and I'll complain about that, and somebody will say, well, but we're still married. And God, so are they. They're just as married as we are. They're just as employed as we used to be. And they have as many kids or more than we do. I don't want that excuse. There's got to be something else going on. A big part of it is how do we do formation? In most parts of Europe and Central and South America, the whole family comes to formation. And whole teams of people take care of the kids while mom and dad are in class. But meal time and prayer time, it's just a lovely mess of everybody being together. We have to be able to risk. We have to be able to risk. Go back to the vision of the founders. What was the insight from Dachau? That I will put myself at risk for somebody. Getting up and preaching a halfway challenging homily is not totally putting yourself at risk. Especially when so many people after you're done, oh, Deacon, that was wonderful. Of course, then the 10 letters that go to the bishop calling you all kinds of names. One of the things that I think we still have not achieved is a sense of the strength of numbers. A lot of times a deacon gets ordained, gets sent to a parish, and he's the only deacon in the parish, and he's done. That's it. He's busy. But how many times do you ever think of putting our deacons together in teams? We're trying to do that in Monterey. We have 3 of our newly ordained guys. The bishop has asked to serve and put together a program for assistance to day laborers. And kind of let these 3 guys just launch and try to get everything set up. How often do we think about doing that kind of creative thing? And again, it wouldn't be that those 3 guys do it all. Those 3 guys develop a plan and they get other folks engaged in it. And again, the notion of balance, balance, balance. And that's what we see in so much of the diaconate life. How do I balance word, worship, and sacrament? Or word, worship, and charity in my own life? How do I balance family, job, ministry? How do I do all that? One guy, a friend of mine used to say, we are the ministers of the dance. My wife doesn't believe it because I don't dance. But that notion of balance. And again, my challenge always to deacons is, are you doing all 3? We don't ordain social workers. There's no need for that. We don't ordain altar servers anymore. We don't do that. We don't need ordination for that. The ordination involves how well we embody all 3 at once. So that when that deacon who spends his time in the prison or in that AIDS hospice steps into that pulpit and preaches, there's a special kind of diaconal charism there that only he can give. And then when he's assisting at the altar, wow, all of that comes together. Let me just throw it open with this last quote. I was going to do all this, but I don't have to. So but I want to get to this. Look at this. This is Cardinal Walter Casper. I've never seen a better description of a balanced approach to diaconal ministry. In his ministry of the altar, the deacon lays the needs of human beings on the Eucharistic table, and naturally he speaks of these needs when he preaches. He must make the parish aware of urgent situations of need, motivating them to share with one another and to give practical help. And the last thing I end with is Deacon Thomas Merton. 1949, I think, Merton was ordained a deacon. And he reflected on this. He said, the first thing about diaconate is that it is big. The more I think about it, the more I realize that it is a major order. You are supposed to be the strength of the church. You receive the Holy Spirit for strength, not only for yourself, but to support the whole church. So, thank you very much. Let's talk.